What if I told you that the roots of the faith we know today are much deeper, more diverse and more African than the history books allowed you to know? What you will see here is the result of years of research into truths that spent centuries buried, so that you never discovered the real origin of our spirituality. This video is not blasphemy or an attack on the Catholic religion, but rather a reinforcement of its history, recognizing the resistance of a people who protected their ancestral roots even in the face of brutal attempts at erasure. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because this knowledge challenges the official narrative and returns protagonism to those who have always been at the center of the sacred. Get ready to discover what was there before the beginning. Let's do it. How can humanity's spiritual history be told in such a linear fashion when what actually existed was a vast mosaic of beliefs and deities? History as we know it often ignores a continent that supported a rich spiritual tapestry long before any Hebrew patriarch ventured into the desert. Africa, the cradle of human civilization, was not only home to peoples, but also a plurality of gods, each with their own domains and histories. The truth is that long before the monotheistic perspective was consolidated, African traditions flourished across the continent. Advanced civilizations like those in the kingdoms of Kush and Aksum not only prospered economically, but also spiritually, with a vast cosmogony that rivaled Greek and Roman mythology. These were not minor gods, but profound entities, such as Nyame from the Akan region, creator of the universe, or Olodumare from the Yoruba, the supreme one, responsible for order and life. Such deities were not just symbols of faith, but living forces in people's daily lives, influencing everything from harvest to political decisions. What few realize is that the impact of these deities was not restricted to African territory. As commercial and cultural exchanges developed, many of these spiritual concepts spread, influencing other traditions around the world. For example, the idea of a distant creative deity, similar to Olodumare, can be traced to several cultures outside of Africa. This suggests a spiritual exchange that challenges the narrative of a single line of truth. Historical records show that African priests were guardians of deep and complex knowledge, often transmitted orally, which required years of learning and practice. The rituals were intricate and had meanings that transcended the visible, connecting the physical world to the spiritual. It is worth asking why these stories were relegated to obscurity while others were elevated to sacred texts. It turns out that colonization not only subjugated people, but also their beliefs, promoting a narrative where local religions were labeled as pagan or primitive. This cultural erasure served to consolidate the vision of a world centered on a single God and a single path to truth, disregarding the spiritual richness that had existed for millennia. Documents prove that in many regions, European colonizers used religion as a tool of domination, replacing local deities with Christian saints in a process of syncretism that masked the true essence of these beliefs. The impact of this is felt to this day, where many African traditions struggle to survive in a world that still values what is foreign more than what is ancestrally theirs. The question that arises is, why is the recognition of these spiritual traditions crucial to our complete understanding of human history? To ignore these roots is to deny an essential part of our collective heritage. Reality shows that recognizing and celebrating African spiritual diversity not only honors those who came before, but also enriches our present, offering a more inclusive and truthful worldview. After all, history is never just a straight line. It is a tangle of paths that intersect, intertwine and complement each other, like the roots of the oldest trees. How is it possible that names as powerful and influential as Zango, Oksum and Ogum have been obscured for centuries? The truth is that before any mention of Yahweh in sacred texts, Africa already had a rich spiritual tradition, where deities were not just abstractions, but cosmic forces that governed everyday life. The Yoruba, one of the largest ethnicities in West Africa, revered a pantheon of orishas, each symbolizing fundamental aspects of human existence. Shango, the Orisha of thunder and justice, not only protected but also judged, balancing power and responsibility in a way that rivaled biblical figures like Moses or Solomon. Your cult, it was deeply rooted in morality and ethics, bringing to the fore issues of social justice and community responsibility. Oxum, the goddess of fresh waters, love and fertility, was much more than a symbol of affection and affection. She represented fertility and prosperity, being invoked in rituals to guarantee abundant harvests and large families. His presence was felt in every river, in every stream, reminding the faithful of the importance of water as a source of life. Ogun, on the other hand, was the indomitable warrior, the opener of paths. It protected those who faced adversity, symbolizing the strength and determination needed to overcome obstacles. Their festivals were celebrations of inner strength, of the human capacity to transform difficulties into achievements. Yemanja, the mother of all Oryxas, reigns over the oceans, symbolizing the primordial motherhood that sustains all life. Their cult, often associated with the Christian figure of Our Lady of Navigators, shows how religious syncretism tried to erase the true essence of these African deities. Yemanja is hailed not only as the protector of fishermen, but as the guardian of life and renewal. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Dahomey, the Fon people worshipped Voduns, deities that operated in a theology as complex as any organized religion in the West. Each Vodun had its own myths, rites, and influences, governing aspects of life ranging from war to harvest. The Bantu people, spread across vast regions of the African continent, had Inquises, powerful spirits, who governed nature and were honored in elaborate ceremonies that included music, dance, and offerings. What few realize is that these spiritual traditions were not mere primitive folklores, but rather sophisticated philosophical systems that offered a coherent and articulated worldview. European colonization, however, with its agenda of cultural domination, systematically devalued and distorted these beliefs, labeling them pagan or superstitious. The colonial strategy of replacing local deities with Christian saints was an attempt to erase centuries of African tradition and wisdom. Reality shows that the survival of these traditions, even in the face of centuries of repression, is a testimony to the resilience and spiritual richness of the African people. Today we see a resurgence of interest in these practices as forms of cultural resistance and identity. Oral traditions, which preserve the essence of these beliefs, are being revalued, and communities are rediscovering the power of their ancestors. The question that remains is, why were these stories and these names forgotten for so long? To ignore these traditions is to deny a vital part of human history, a chapter that offers valuable lessons about diversity, resilience, and spiritual interconnection. By reclaiming these names, we not only honor the past but also enrich our present, expanding our understanding of the sacred and the divine. After all, humanity's true spiritual story is a complex and vibrant mosaic, and each piece is crucial to forming the complete picture. What does the presence of other gods in the biblical narrative really mean? When we read that Yahweh proclaims, "You shall have no other gods before me," we are led to consider the existence of other divine entities. This commandment not only acknowledges the presence of other gods, but suggests a competitive spiritual environment. Reality shows that in ancient times, the Near East was a boiling cauldron of worship and devotion to multiple deities, each representing different forces and aspects of life and nature. The facts reveal that these deities were not merely inventions of ancient people, but rather entities with established cults, temples, priests, and rituals that offered tangible spiritual answers and solutions to everyday problems. In the book of Exodus, the magicians of Egypt, by replicating Moses' miracles, demonstrate the existence of a spiritual power that demanded respect and recognition. This was not just illusory magic, but a reflection of a complex spiritual reality where multiple gods coexisted. History reveals that figures such as Baal, Asherah, and Dagon were not mere stone idols, but representations of natural and social forces that the Hebrews encountered throughout their journeys. Baal, for example, was the storm god, a symbol of fertility and prosperity, essential in a region where rain was vital for survival. Asherah, often associated with fertility and motherhood, was venerated on many Israelite altars, as evidenced by archaeological finds that show her image alongside Yahweh in ancient inscriptions. What few realize is that these gods not only represented aspects of life, but played central roles in the political and social alliances of the time. The worship of local deities was, in many cases, an expression of cultural identity and resistance against external domination. When biblical texts narrate the Hebrews turning to other gods, it is not just a question of faith, but a complex game of cultural, political, and spiritual influences. Analysis indicates that Yahweh's insistence on exclusivity may have been a response to the fear of loss of control over the Hebrew people, whose constant contact with other cultures could dilute the worship dedicated to him. This context explains why biblical prophets and leaders worked so hard to eradicate the worship of other gods, often resorting to drastic measures such as destroying altars and executing priests of rival deities. Historical documents and archaeological evidence reinforce the idea that the Israelites lived at a cultural crossroads, influenced by the spiritual traditions of neighboring peoples. The legends and myths of the Canaanites, Babylonians, Egyptians, and Hittites permeated everyday life, offering narratives that answered existential questions that perhaps the covenant with Yahweh did not so readily address. The question that remains is why, then, the biblical narrative chose such a rigorous path of exclusivity. Was it a need to consolidate a people under a single spiritual leadership, to resist the constant threats of cultural and political assimilation, or even a strategic vision to ensure cohesion and identity in the midst of a world in constant change and challenge? The truth is that the presence of other gods in the Bible is not a mere detail, but a testimony to a vibrant and diverse spiritual world where the search for meaning and power transcended the boundaries of a single God. Thus, the biblical narrative not only records the history of a people, but also portrays the complexity of a spiritual universe that continues to intrigue and inspire to this day. When the Church's first councils met to decide which texts would be considered canonical, it was not a simple question of spirituality, but a carefully orchestrated political maneuver. The Book of Enoch, a text that detailed the fall of angels to earth and their interactions with humanity, was one of the documents that was not only deleted, but systematically suppressed. This text was not just a collection of myths. He described an exchange of spiritual knowledge that transcended cultural and geographic boundaries, suggesting that Africa played a central role in these accounts. Reality shows that the erasure of African deities and their spiritual traditions was a meticulous strategy of cultural and religious domination. By reclassifying African gods as demons or evil entities, the project of Christian expansion not only delegitimized these beliefs, but also reinforced the notion that these traditions were primitive, making it easier to impose a single worldview. This narrative justified colonialism by insinuating that African spirituality needed salvation and civilization, a premise that concealed the true goal of control and exploitation. The facts reveal that, during the centuries of colonization, European powers made use of religious structures to consolidate their dominance. Churches were erected over African sacred sites, and Christian saints were syncretized with local deities in an attempt to erase the original spiritual identity of colonized peoples. This process was not just a replacement of beliefs, but a cultural erasure that aimed to eliminate the deep roots of spiritual and cultural resistance. Evidence points to a continued resistance of these traditions, which, despite attempts at eradication, have managed to survive secretly. People who kept their spirituality alive faced persecution, but their practices continued to be passed down from generation to generation, often encoded in songs, dances, and stories that masked their true spiritual meaning. This resilience not only preserved the essence of these beliefs, but also served as an act of resistance against colonial oppression. Historical records show that religious syncretism, far from being a mere fusion of beliefs, was a survival strategy. By adopting aspects of Christianity, African traditions ensured their continuity. But what few realize is that this fusion also influenced Christianity, enriching it with concepts and practices that, without the African contribution, would have been lost. This challenges the narrative that African spirituality was passive or inferior, revealing instead a vital source of spiritual influence. History reveals that the attempt to erase African deities was one part of a larger effort to rewrite humanity's spiritual history, centering it around a single narrative. By unraveling these layers of concealment, we are led to question the motivations behind these decisions and to recognize the spiritual richness that has been deliberately left aside. The true story of African spirituality is not just a lost chapter, but a centerpiece of a mosaic that continues to challenge dominant narratives. So the question remains, what do we gain from reclaiming and recognizing these forgotten spiritual traditions? In doing so, we not only honor those who have kept these traditions alive, but we also expand our understanding of the divine, accepting that spiritual truth is multifaceted, and that Africa, with all its diversity and depth, has always been a fundamental pillar of that truth. Archaeology reveals a world that defies traditional historical chronology. Megalithic structures throughout Africa, such as the pyramids of Meroe in Nubia and the astronomical observatories of Mali, demonstrate a technological advance that goes against the limitations attributed to the time. These monuments are not only made of stone, but represent a deep knowledge of mathematics and astronomy that intrigues scholars. Reality shows that these constructions point to a sophisticated understanding of the cosmos, something that should not exist according to conventional historical narratives. This archaeological evidence in itself would be enough to raise questions about the true origin of this knowledge. The Book of Enoch, an apocryphal text of great importance, offers an alternative narrative that challenges traditional understanding. The Watchers, angels who supposedly descended to Earth, are described as bearers of advanced wisdom, including the art of metallurgy, the science of the stars, and the construction of monumental structures. This text is not officially accepted by Western theology, but its existence and preservation in Ethiopian tradition indicate a deeper connection between these stories and the African continent. Ethiopia, with its rich Orthodox Christian tradition, has preserved these texts while the rest of the Christian world has chosen to ignore or suppress them. This raises the question, why were some stories deleted while others were kept? The facts reveal that Ethiopian texts contain details that not only enrich but also complicate the traditional biblical narrative. They speak of an Africa that was not just a passive backdrop, but an active protagonist in the spiritual history of humanity. Connections between the legends of the Watchers and African technological advancement suggest that the continent may have been a center of spiritual and scientific knowledge that Western history has been unable or unwilling to recognize. This deliberate concealment of information may have been an attempt to centralize religious and cultural power around a dominant European narrative. Research shows that African oral traditions, passed down from generation to generation, preserve information that written records did not capture. These traditions tell stories of gods and celestial beings who interacted with humanity, teaching and guiding. While archaeology excavates physical evidence of these contacts, oral traditions provide human and spiritual context, filling in gaps that science alone cannot explain. When we combine these sources, a picture emerges of a vibrant and intellectually advanced Africa, whose impact on the ancient world has been systematically underestimated or ignored. Evidence indicates that the systematic erasure of African contributions to world knowledge was a strategy in a broader project of cultural colonization. By replacing African narratives with a homogenized European worldview, it was possible to dominate not only territories, but also minds and spirits. However, the resilience of African traditions, preserved in apocryphal texts and oral traditions, challenges this narrative and invites a re-evaluation of human history. The question that arises is, are we willing to accept the complexity and richness of the African contribution to human civilization? By ignoring these stories, we lose a vital part of our common past, a past that not only belongs to Africa, but to humanity as a whole. It is time to re-examine what has been erased and recognize that spiritual and historical truth is more multifaceted than we have been led to believe. After all, what else is hidden in the shadows of history, waiting to be discovered? How is it possible that Africa, the birthplace of so many fundamental biblical stories, is often relegated to a secondary role in religious narratives? The truth is that the Bible not only mentions Africa, but places it at the center of crucial events. The saga of Abraham, for example, takes us to Egypt, one of the epicenters of African civilization, where he interacts directly with the pharaoh. This is not just a geographic detail, it is a recognition of Egypt's cultural and political influence on Hebrew history. Moses, a central figure in the Old Testament, was not only born in a Hebrew context, but was raised and educated as an Egyptian, steeped in an African tradition of knowledge that was respected and feared by his contemporaries. It turns out that Joseph, sold into slavery, rose to the position of second in command in Egypt, demonstrating not only his political and administrative skill, but also the recognition of his wisdom in an African context. This is not a tale of a foreigner who briefly visits the land of the pharaohs, but of a man who becomes essential to the survival of a nation during times of crisis. The presence of Jesus in Africa, taken to Egypt to escape Herod's persecution, underlines the idea that Africa was a place of refuge and safety, a divine sanctuary for the Son of God himself. And who could ignore the Queen of Sheba, who not only visited Solomon, but brought with her a legacy of wealth and wisdom that impressed even the wisest of kings, according to biblical tradition. What few realize is that the Bible not only mentions African figures, but also recognizes their importance and influence. Cux, son of Ham, is a direct ancestor of many African peoples and appears repeatedly in the narrative as a figure of importance. Their descendants are not mere extras, they are protagonists in stories that shape the direction of the biblical narrative. The reality shows that Africa played a vital role not just as a setting, but as an integral character in the history of Abrahamic religions. But what was done over the centuries was an attempt to obscure this centrality, transforming the African presence into a mere footnote. Studies indicate that this marginalization is not accidental. With the advance of European colonialism, religious narratives were adapted to serve the interests of colonizers who sought to reduce the influence of African traditions. The Bible, a sacred text that contained clear African connections, was reinterpreted to minimize these connections, promoting a worldview that justified European domination and subsequent exploitation of African peoples. Historical documents show that this approach was a deliberate strategy, used to reinforce the notion that Africa needed to be civilized and converted, ignoring the rich spiritual tapestry that already existed on the continent. Evidence suggests that by rediscovering and highlighting Africa's role in the Bible, we are not only correcting a historical error, but also recognizing the crucial contribution the continent made to the formation of spiritual traditions that shape the world to this day. By illuminating these connections, we reveal a richer, fuller story that challenges dominant narratives and celebrates the spiritual diversity that has always been present but has often been relegated to oblivion. The question that arises is clear. If Africa was so central to the biblical narrative, why was its importance systematically erased? Perhaps it is time to reevaluate what we consider to be true sacred history, recognizing that Africa has always been more than a setting. She has always been a protagonist. How is it possible that a continent so rich in spiritual traditions has suffered cultural erasure of such magnitude? When slave ships began crossing the Atlantic in the 15th century, the project of African cultural erasure took on an unprecedented dimension, becoming a true cultural genocide. It was not just about rewriting texts or banning books, but about destroying a living civilization with its priests, rituals, languages, and memories. Toreros were burned down, guardians of sacred knowledge murdered or separated from their disciples, and languages banned under penalty of death. African names were replaced by European names, and children were prevented from learning from their elders. This was a deliberate effort to cut off the current of transmission that kept the connection with the ancestors and deities alive. The facts reveal that, although the objective of erasure was partially achieved, much was lost. Traditions that existed millennia ago today only remain in fragments, in incomplete memories or in records made by colonizers who did not understand what they were documenting. This can be seen in the way religious rituals and practices have been simplified or misinterpreted, often labeled superstition or witchcraft. The truth is that the intention was not only to convert Africans to Christianity, but also to destroy any trace of their original spiritual identity. However, what has survived is extraordinary. Candomblé, Umbanda, Haitian Voodoo, Cuban Santeria, and Jurema, among other traditions Afro-diasporic, they are living monuments to the human capacity to resist the impossible. These belief systems are not mere relics of the past. They are vibrant spiritual practices that continue to evolve and enrich the lives of millions of people around the world. They demonstrate remarkable resilience, showing how African traditions have adapted and survived, even under conditions of extreme oppression. The Orixas, deities of the Yoruba pantheon, are a clear example of this survival. They crossed the Atlantic in the bodies and souls of the enslaved when everything else was taken. Forcibly brought to the New World, enslaved Africans found ways to preserve their beliefs. Using religious syncretism as a tool, they associated their Orixas with Catholic saints, disguising their practices under the cloak of Christianity. This syncretism not only allowed African traditions to survive, but also profoundly influenced Christian practices in the Americas. History reveals that this transformation was not just an act of survival, but a form of cultural resistance. Candomblé terreiros and Umbanda houses became centers of resistance where African culture could be expressed and preserved. Even under the watchful eye of the colonizers, practitioners kept the flame of their traditions alive. Furthermore, these spiritual practices functioned as an emotional and psychological refuge for the enslaved, offering hope and strength amid the brutality of slavery. What few realize is that this cultural resistance was not just a matter of preserving the past, but of building a future. Afro-diasporic traditions continue to evolve, incorporating elements from other cultures and adapting to new social and political realities. Today, they stand as a testament to the human capacity to adapt and resist, challenging the dominant narratives that have tried to erase them. The question that remains is, how willing are we to recognize and celebrate this cultural resilience? By honoring these traditions, we not only preserve a fundamental part of African history, but we also enrich our understanding of what it means to be human. After all, if these traditions could survive centuries of attempted erasure, what else can we learn from them about resistance and identity? How is it possible that African deities, rich in history and influence, have been reduced to mere demons in the Western view? The answer is rooted in a complex tangle of racism and politics, which has transformed a rich spiritual tapestry into a narrative of fear and contempt. The truth is that African deities such as Zango, Oxum, and Ogum had a deep connection with the communities that revered them. They were not just distant figures, but actively participated in everyday life, influencing everything from personal decisions to social policies. However, the European colonial project could not allow such beliefs to prosper. To justify slavery and colonization, it was necessary to demonize these traditions, portraying them as primitive and dangerous. Historical evidence demonstrates that the demonization of African deities was a deliberate strategy. While Greek and Roman gods could be romantically explored as part of the European legacy, African deities needed to be discredited lest their rich spiritual traditions threaten the narrative of European cultural superiority. Reality shows that, for the colonizer, recognizing the legitimacy and power of African religions would also mean recognizing the humanity and equality of African peoples, something that would subvert the entire structure of political and economic domination. Historical records show that colonial churches played a crucial role in this process of demonization. European missionaries saw African religions as an obstacle to Christian conversion. Thus, they associated these practices with Satanism, a tactic that not only facilitated missionary work, but also justified the brutal repression against cults considered heretical. Documents from the period reveal that African rituals were routinely described as acts of witchcraft and idolatry, a narrative that was convenient for those seeking to exploit the continent's riches without moral challenge. What few realize is that this demonization was not only an attack on deities, but also an attempt to destroy the cultural and spiritual identity of African peoples. Religious traditions were, and still are, central to social cohesion and cultural resistance. By portraying priests as sorcerers and rituals as diabolical practices, colonizers sought to dismantle social structures that could challenge their rule. Studies indicate that this strategy has been successful in many cases, but not without resistance. It turns out that despite attempts at erasure, African spiritual traditions have survived and continue to flourish. Religious syncretism, where African deities were associated with Catholic saints, allowed spiritual practices to be maintained under colonial surveillance. This cultural resistance not only preserved these traditions, but also transformed the religious landscape of the Americas, profoundly influencing culture and spirituality in countries such as Brazil, Cuba, and Haiti. History reveals that the demonization of African deities was more than a simple matter of religious prejudice. It was a tool of control used to justify the subjugation of an entire people and erase their cultural heritage. By understanding this context, we are challenged to re-evaluate dominant narratives and recognize the value and depth of African spiritual traditions. After all, the question remains, how can we redefine our understanding of spirituality and justice while recognizing the invaluable contribution of African gods in the spiritual tapestry of humanity? The effects of the spiritual erasure of African traditions are profound and painful. Imagine growing up in an environment where the stories and traditions of your ancestors are constantly devalued, labeled as primitive or even demonic. This is not a distant phenomenon. It is a reality experienced by many who see their spiritual roots being delegitimized. When young people of African descent are taught to fear or reject the orishas venerated by their grandparents, they are not only losing a spiritual connection, but also an essential part of their cultural identity. This fear and rejection are the result of a historical process of colonization that sought to eliminate any trace of African cultural and spiritual resistance. The truth is that this erasure has not only affected the self-image of those of African descent, but it has also shaped the global perception of their spiritual practices. African religions, such as Candomblé or Umbanda, often face prejudice and violence, with toreros being attacked and practitioners marginalized. This type of aggression is not just a rejection of religion, but a direct attack on the right to exist and practice a rich and complex spiritual tradition. What few realize is that these practices are a testimony to the cultural resistance and resilience of people who, despite centuries of repression, kept the flame of their spirituality alive. The reality shows that many young black people face an internal conflict when they are taught to disregard their own spiritual traditions in favor of a European heritage that is presented as superior or civilized. This teaching perpetuates the logic of colonization, where everything African is seen as inferior and needs to be corrected. When a person internalizes this narrative, they not only reject their spiritual roots, but they also come to believe that there is something fundamentally wrong with their own identity. This leads to a profound disconnection where many feel incomplete or unworthy of their ancestral heritage. Documents prove that this devaluation of African traditions was a deliberate strategy during colonization, used to justify the domination and exploitation of African peoples. By portraying their spiritual practices as barbaric or evil, colonizers were able to destabilize communities, undermining their social cohesion and cultural identity. This strategy not only facilitated economic exploitation, but also ensured that future generations would grow up without pride or connection to their traditions. The facts reveal that rescuing and valuing the African spiritual heritage is crucial for rebuilding the identity and dignity of African descendants. This reconnection offers not only a richer understanding of self, but also an opportunity to celebrate the diversity and depth of traditions that have resisted erasure. Recognizing this past is not just an act of historical justice, it is also a vital step toward healing and strengthening communities that have been historically marginalized. The question that remains is, how can we reverse centuries of cultural devaluation and erasure? The answer may lie in a conscious effort to educate and celebrate these traditions, promoting a dialogue that recognizes African spiritual richness as an integral part of the global tapestry of humanity. After all, by reclaiming these stories, we not only honor the ancestors who kept them alive, but we also enrich our understanding of what it means to be truly human.